The ocean seemed ordinary that day, calm and indifferent, but the world was moments away from witnessing the arrival of something humanity had never seen before. At the height of the Cold War, while the United States and the Soviet Union collided not just over territory, but over ideology itself, America made a decision that would forever redefine the future of naval warfare: the construction of the world's first nuclear-powered aircraft carrier. Its name would be USS Enterprise. And just like the fictional Enterprise that would one day explore distant galaxies, this one, too, was born with an audacious purpose: to go farther than any ship had ever gone before. Construction began in the late 1950s, at a time when the world was still grappling with the true potential of atomic power. For some, nuclear energy symbolized danger; for others, hope. But for the United States Navy, it represented something far more profound: freedom. A ship capable of sailing for years without refueling. A ship large enough to carry an entire air force on its back. A ship fast enough to cross oceans before the enemy could even react. A ship powerful enough to sustain a full-scale war on its own. And so, piece by piece, plate by plate, the Enterprise began to take shape. At the Newport News shipyard, workers realized almost immediately that they were building something extraordinary. The hull was longer, sleeker, and more imposing than anything the world had ever seen. The island structure, tall, narrow, futuristic, looked like it had stepped out of science fiction. It didn't take long for the ship to earn its legendary nickname, Big E. But what truly set Enterprise apart was invisible. Hidden deep within its massive frame were 8 nuclear reactors, 8 relentless hearts that would power this floating city at speeds other navies could only dream of. It was clean, silent, continuous power, a revolution forged in steel. In 1960, when the ship touched water for the first time, the world paused. Enterprise was unlike anything before it, a fusion of military might, technological ambition, and political boldness. At 342 meters long, she was so massive that many claimed she defied the limits of engineering. Her flight deck could handle heavy jets, bombers, and supersonic fighters all operating at once. She was not simply an aircraft carrier. She was a force multiplier, a weapon designed to extend America's reach across the entire planet.
When Enterprise officially entered service in 1961, the global reaction was immediate. Allied nations celebrated the arrival of a nuclear guardian. The Soviet Union watched with unease, realizing that the ship represented not just military strength, but a technological leap that would alter the balance of naval power. And then, only months later, the world plunged into one of the most dangerous crises in modern history: the Cuban Missile Crisis. This would be the Enterprise's true debut. As the United States and the Soviet Union approached the brink of nuclear war, Enterprise surged into the Caribbean with her air wing ready to launch at a moment's notice. Analysts at the time believed her presence played a crucial role in America's demonstration of strength, not as a symbol, but as an operational weapon. Enterprise was not just military power, she was psychological pressure. A message written in steel: if war begins, we are ready to fight and ready to win. And so, before completing even 1 year of service, the USS Enterprise had already become a central piece on the world's strategic chessboard. But her story had only just begun. In the decades that followed, she would take part in wars, diplomatic crises, secret operations, disasters, heroic rescues, and events that would shape entire generations of sailors and aviators. She would fly more missions than any carrier in history. She would travel farther than any warship ever built.
and she would serve for more than 50 years, surviving eras, technologies, and conflicts. Enterprise was not just a ship, she was an idea, a symbol, the future sailing through the present. And on that quiet morning in 1961, as she lifted anchor for her first great mission, no one could have imagined that this nuclear giant would become the most legendary aircraft carrier the world had ever seen. This is our journey, the story of the ship that changed naval warfare forever. USS Enterprise, the first of her kind, the greatest of her time, and the most unforgettable of all. When USS Enterprise left port for her first real missions, there was something almost symbolic in the way she moved. For observers watching from the shore, the ship seemed to glide with an unnatural lightness, far too graceful for something so colossal. But that sensation, the impression that the impossible was suddenly real, was exactly what defined her nature. She was not just an aircraft carrier, she was a declaration that a new era had begun. Inside her long steel corridors, the crew was still adapting to the idea of living within a ship powered by 8 nuclear reactors. Many of the sailors were young, some had never left their home state, others had never seen the ocean before enlisting, and now they found themselves working inside what felt like a floating scientific laboratory, surrounded by machines so advanced they almost seemed alive. On the flight deck, the tests intensified. The roar of F-4 Phantom II engines echoed like artificial thunder, while pilots practiced increasingly precise takeoffs. It was a mechanical ballet, dozens of men running, signaling, adjusting, checking every single detail. It became clear early on, Enterprise was too fast to fail, too big to stop, too powerful to hesitate. But the true test would come soon. 1962. The world was holding its breath. The United States and the Soviet Union seemed to be walking directly into a nuclear clash. Satellites, spy planes, diplomats, generals, everyone understood that a single mistake could end modern civilization. When the Cuban Missile Crisis erupted, the U.S. Navy mobilized everything it had, and Enterprise was placed at the front of the naval formation. For days that felt like entire years, the carrier remained on full alert. Pilots slept in their flight suits, ready to sprint to the deck the moment an alarm sounded. Officers monitored radar screens, radio frequencies, and Soviet activity without rest. The smallest sign of attack would demand immediate retaliation, and Enterprise would be the epicenter of that response. But war did not come. Negotiation prevailed, and the world stepped back from the edge. Yet for the Enterprise crew, something had changed forever. They had lived a war that never happened. They had touched the invisible line separating history from tragedy. And that experience would shape the ship's identity for decades.
After the crisis, Enterprise returned to the United States as a silent hero. There were no parades or extravagant ceremonies. But behind closed doors, U.S. leaders knew exactly what the carrier represented, a strategic advantage no other nation possessed. And then came Vietnam. 1964. The conflict in Southeast Asia was escalating, and the U.S. needed to project force quickly. Enterprise sailed toward the region still in her operational youth, but already carrying the confidence of a veteran. As she approached Vietnamese waters, the carrier unleashed her air wing like a predator finally finding its hunting grounds. Pilots launched in endless waves. F-4 Phantom, A-4 Skyhawk, A-6 Intruder, aircraft that would become symbols of the war. The deck shook under the impact of the catapults. Every launch felt as though it pushed the massive ship backward. It was speed, heat, smoke, precision,
discipline, and sacrifice. Enterprise entered Vietnam not just as a war machine, but as the embodiment of an entire strategy. Her aircraft struck targets along the coast, demolished bridges, disrupted supply lines, supported ground troops fighting an enemy hidden within dense forests. For every mission that returned safely, another immediately surged toward danger. There was no rest, no pause. The war consumed everything. And it was during this period that the ship proved her greatest advantage: autonomy. While other carriers required refueling every few days, Enterprise simply kept going, as if she possessed infinite power. For those who served aboard her, the sensation was surreal, living on a metal island that never needed to stop. But war always takes its toll. In January 1969, Enterprise suffered one of the darkest moments in her entire history. An accidental missile explosion on the flight deck triggered a devastating chain reaction. Flames engulfed aircraft loaded with fuel and ordnance. Secondary explosions rocked the ship, shaking her as though she were being torn apart.
Chaos consumed the vessel, yet the discipline of the U.S. Navy held strong. Sailors ran straight into the fire without hesitation, knowing that what was at stake was not just the ship, but thousands of lives. Smoke flooded passageways, storerooms, and cabins. Sirens wailed like metallic cries. Emergency crews, exhausted and injured, fought until they could barely stand. When the flames were finally extinguished, dozens of sailors lay dead, many of them heroes, and for the first time, Enterprise had seemed mortal. But she survived. Weeks of repairs were necessary, yet eventually the Colossus returned to duty, because Enterprise, from her birth onward, carried a certain destiny. She was the ship that always came back, the ship that always continued, the ship that never rested. As the 1970s progressed, the carrier remained active, taking part in exercises, international operations, and displays of power that shaped the world's balance. Her legend grew within the Navy. Serving aboard Enterprise meant becoming part of a lineage of honor, living inside a story being written in real time. Onboard technology evolved constantly. New radars, better communication systems, more advanced aircraft. The ship that had been born as a nuclear experiment was transforming year after year into an increasingly sophisticated fortress. And then something unexpected happened. The world changed. The Cold War persisted, but with new tensions, new players, new horizons. Enterprise, however, shifted with the times effortlessly, as if she had been designed not just to cross oceans, but to cross eras. Her sailors described her in many ways: a floating city, a living weapon, a world of its own. But in one thing they all agreed: Enterprise was unique. No other ship on Earth had her presence, her energy, her soul. And by the late 1970s, while many World War II battleships and carriers had already been retired or scrapped, Enterprise remained steady, ready for challenges that had not even been imagined. She had been born in the shadow of nuclear war, had fought in Vietnam, had endured disaster, had survived technological revolutions. And all of this before even reaching her prime. The true era of Enterprise was still coming, and when it arrived, the world would turn its eyes to her once again.
The end of the 1970s did not bring rest to USS Enterprise. If anything, it brought a new identity. The world was shifting rapidly. Regimes were falling, wars were emerging in silence, alliances forming and dissolving overnight. And at the center of that geopolitical storm, there was one ship that somehow always seemed to be present whenever global tensions reached their breaking point. Enterprise had become more than an aircraft carrier. She had become a floating reminder that the American presence, even amid chaos, was constant. And that constancy made her an essential piece on an increasingly complex global chessboard. As the 1980s began, the Cold War entered a new phase. The Soviet Union pushed its influence into strategic regions. Regional conflicts ignited like sparks, threatening to erupt into global infernos. Enterprise was summoned again and again to respond, as though she had become the shadow of American power cast across the oceans. Her first major challenge of this new era arose in the Middle East. When the Iranian Revolution swept across Tehran in 1979 and the U.S. Embassy was overtaken, the world understood that a new age of instability had begun. The crisis was so volatile that the U.S. Navy deployed its most formidable ships to the region. Naturally, USS Enterprise was among them, positioning herself in the Persian Gulf as a silent warning that even in uncertain times, American power was watching. The crew felt the weight of history pressing upon them. Every aircraft launch, every patrol, every surveillance sweep carried tension. They knew that a single aggressive action could trigger consequences that spiraled beyond anyone's control. And yet they also understood that retreat was not an option. On the flight deck, the routine was relentless. The searing Gulf temperatures radiated through the steel, making every task more punishing. But no one complained. Everyone, from the pilots to the catapult teams, knew that their actions shaped not only military operations, but political decisions, diplomatic negotiations, and the future of an entire region. It was during this period that Enterprise gained an unofficial nickname among some officers, the Steel Ambassador. Not because she spoke, but simply because she existed, because her presence alone changed the tone of entire conflicts, because diplomacy, more often than not, is enforced by the shadow of giants over the sea. And the 1980s had much more in store. The arms race between the Soviet Union and the United States accelerated to unprecedented levels. New missiles, supersonic fighters, nuclear submarines, spy satellites. The entire planet lived inside a perpetual chess match where a single miscalculation could unleash catastrophe. By now, equipped with even more advanced technology, Enterprise became a crucial platform in this global strategy. During joint exercises with allies, her presence was almost theatrical. Smaller ships sailed around her like an escorting royal procession. Helicopters buzzed above her superstructure like restless insects. F-14 Tomcats roared from the deck, reminding the world that this ship was, quite literally, a mobile airbase with the power to operate in any hemisphere she chose. Then came Lebanon. Political instability exploded in 1982, drawing international forces into a brutal conflict. Enterprise was sent once again to the Mediterranean, a mission layered with danger and responsibility. Her aircraft patrolled contested skies, supported Allied troops, and monitored hostile movements on land and sea. For many, the ship's presence served as a guarantee that the situation would not spiral completely out of control. But nothing could prepare the world for what would follow. In 1988, tensions in the Persian Gulf escalated sharply when U.S. ships began escorting oil tankers to protect them from Iranian attacks during what became known as the Tanker War. Enterprise was at the heart of that effort, providing air cover, constant surveillance, and operational coordination. Then, disaster struck. USS Samuel B. Roberts hit an Iranian mine. The explosion was catastrophic. The crew fought desperately to save the ship, and the American response was immediate. Operation Praying Mantis began, the largest U.S. naval battle since World War II. And once again, Enterprise was there. Her aircraft struck Iranian targets, destroying militarized oil platforms, vessels, and key positions. The operation was brief but intense, an unmistakable demonstration that American naval power was not merely symbolic but decisively real. For many historians, that moment marked a turning point. Until then, Enterprise had been the colossal ship that commanded respect. After 1988, she became the colossal ship that changed the outcome of conflicts when required. But history still had one more revolution prepared, not geopolitical, but internal.
The crew of Enterprise began to understand that the ship was not just a temporary home, but a part of who they were. Stories passed through the corridors like legends carried across generations. Young sailors listened to tales of missions that happened before they were born. Veteran pilots pointed at marks on the deck, explaining how each one represented a crucial moment in naval history. There was a silent pride, difficult to define, the feeling of belonging to something far larger than themselves. Meanwhile, the ship continued to evolve technologically. Defense systems improved. Computers replaced analog mechanisms. Communications grew faster, safer, more expansive. Enterprise no longer resembled the ship launched in the early 1960s. She had become something hybrid, part history, part future. And then, as the late 1980s arrived, the Cold War began to tremble. Political speeches changed tone, walls prepared to fall, and for the first time since her creation, Enterprise sailed not just as a weapon, but as a witness to an era that was beginning to fade. The crew, without realizing it, was about to live through the transition between two worlds, the bipolar world that defined the second half of the 20th century and the uncertain, fragmented, unpredictable world that would emerge after. But for Enterprise, this shift did not mean rest. Quite the opposite. It meant that her greatest mission was still ahead. Her role in history was far from complete. Her impact, far from diminishing, was about to rise. And her presence, now firmly established as a symbol of power and continuity, would be more necessary than ever. Because the nuclear giant sailed not only across oceans, she sailed across time. And time, as always, would demand its due. When the year 1989 announced its arrival, USS Enterprise sailed through waters that looked calm on the surface, yet nothing in those days was truly calm. The entire planet trembled with profound change, and the nuclear giant that had spent decades serving as a strategic weapon of the Cold War now found itself facing an uncertain horizon. The Soviet Union showed unmistakable signs of collapse. Communist-aligned regimes were falling one after another, and the famous Berlin Wall, absolute symbol of an era, was living its final days. And while millions celebrated in the streets of Europe the dawn of a new era, Enterprise watched from afar, a silent witness to history. For years, her mission had been to prevent the Cold War confrontation from erupting into open conflict. Now, with one superpower on the brink of dissolution, the ship had to discover a new purpose. The world was changing, and Enterprise had to change with it. As the 1990s approached, a question spread among military strategists. What role would aircraft carriers play in a world without the Soviet threat? Some believed these nuclear giants were destined to become redundant relics. Others argued the opposite, that in an unstable world with no clear boundaries, carriers would be more important than ever. After all, the air power projected from their decks remained one of humanity's most flexible and decisive military tools. Enterprise, as she had always done, would prove the point in practice. When Iraq invaded Kuwait in August 1990, the world was pulled into a new kind of conflict. No longer a battle of ideologies between superpowers, it was something more complex, a regional showdown with global consequences.
Enterprise was immediately dispatched to the Persian Gulf, beginning her role in Operation Desert Shield, which soon transformed into the famous Operation Desert Storm. Upon arriving in the region, the ship's flight deck erupted into constant activity. F-14 Tomcats were checked, refueled, armed, and launched with almost ritual rhythm. Helicopters hovered above the fleet like restless sentinels. Radar operators scanned the skies for any sign of hostilities. It was as if the ship had awakened into a second youth, focused, disciplined, and fully aligned with her new mission. For many sailors, this was their first real operation after the Cold War's symbolic end. They carried not only the weight of military responsibility, but also a symbolic burden to prove that Enterprise was still indispensable in a world redefining its priorities. When war officially began, the nuclear giant became one of the conflict's nerve centers. Her aircraft executed strikes, reconnaissance missions, electronic sweeps, and critical interceptions. The pace was relentless. Orders arrived by the hour. Each day, the crew witnessed moments they would carry for the rest of their lives.
And when the ceasefire was declared, a curious feeling spread across the ship. Not only relief, but a certainty that Enterprise still had much to offer, perhaps more than ever. But the world, as always, offered no rest. In the years that followed, instability became the new norm. Enterprise sailed through regions plagued by almost continuous conflict: Somalia, the Balkans, Bosnia, the Middle East. The crew grew accustomed to navigating waters shadowed by civil wars, ethnic cleansing, religious tension, and political chaos. In each mission, the ship played a different role: sometimes deterrent, sometimes protector, sometimes first to act, sometimes the last hope of peace. With each deployment, her reputation grew. It was during this era that Enterprise earned another nickname, whispered in corridors, appearing in informal reports, and repeated in speeches: the Big E reborn. And indeed, she was reborn. After decades serving as a weapon against a single great adversary, the ship transformed into something broader, a global instrument of stability, capable of intervening in local crises with worldwide impact. Her presence sent a message: if there's danger, we are here. If conflict is rising, we can arrive before it grows. If there's a threat, it will not go unanswered. Then came the day that would change the 21st century and would forever change USS Enterprise. On the morning of September 11, 2001, while the ship carried out routine operations in the Persian Gulf, the world watched in shock as the United States suffered its most devastating attack in modern history. The crew stood motionless before the ship's televisions. Many could not believe what they were witnessing. Commercial aircraft turned into weapons, cities burning, millions of lives altered in seconds. And then something extraordinary happened. While almost the entire U.S. military scrambled to reorganize, USS Enterprise, by pure fate positioned in a strategic location, became the first American aircraft carrier to respond militarily to the attacks. Hours after the towers fell, Enterprise aircraft were already over the Middle East, flying patrols, reconnaissance missions, and tactical preparations. It was as if the ship had been placed there by destiny, ready to act in the very moment a new era began. On the flight deck, sailors worked in total silence. No longer just discipline, but anger, fear, grief, and a profound sense of historical duty. Many later said in interviews that they had never felt the emotional weight of their service as deeply as on that day. Enterprise became, in a matter of hours, the ship that launched the first U.S. military operations of the War on Terror.
And this only reinforced the truth everyone already knew. Whenever the world changed, Enterprise was always there. But as she carried out the first strikes against Taliban positions in Afghanistan, a new understanding began to take shape among military historians. Enterprise was no longer just the world's first nuclear-powered carrier. She was the ship that had witnessed and influenced three distinct global eras: the era of superpowers, the era of uncertainty, and the era of global terrorism. Few machines in human history had played roles so different, so decisive, and for so long. Her crew felt this, her admirals understood it, and if the ship could speak, she would likely carry this weight with pride. Yet Enterprise's story was far from complete. She would still face wars, crises, attacks, technological revolutions, and unexpected challenges. And with each trial, her legend would grow even more. Because some ships are not just steel, they are memory, they are witnesses, they are protagonists. And among all vessels ever built by human hands, few, very few, would ever carry as much history as USS Enterprise, CVN 65. The nuclear giant sailed into a new century, carrying not only the flag of a nation, but the legacy of entire generations. And once more, the world was about to change.
The dawn of 2002 found USS Enterprise sailing through waters that had never seen an American aircraft carrier return to combat so soon after an attack on its own homeland. It was as if the ship was fulfilling an inevitable destiny, a destiny it had helped shape since the day it was conceived. Now, more than ever, its presence in the Middle East carried a meaning far beyond military action. It symbolized response, resilience, and resolve. When the first aircraft launched from her deck to strike Taliban positions, there was a palpable sense that this moment would remain etched forever in the memories of everyone on board. Many sailors had never experienced real combat. Others, veterans of operations from the 80s and 90s, stood at the railings with hardened expressions, recognizing the historical weight of that morning. And so, Enterprise began her role in a war that would last for decades. Air operations were relentless. Each launch reverberated through the hull like a heartbeat, the mechanical pulse of the nuclear giant quickening with every completed mission. Engines roared day and night, and the flight deck buzzed with almost choreographed precision. Crews moved like living gears, perfectly synchronized, transforming the ship into a continuous war machine. But despite the efficiency, something new hovered over Enterprise, a shadow that felt deeply emotional. The attacks of September 11th were not a distant conflict for those sailors. Many had family in New York, friends in Washington, memories tied to places now scarred or destroyed. Their military duty blended with a profound sense of personal loss. For some, each aircraft launched felt like a personal response. And yet, it was only the beginning. After months of non-stop operations, Enterprise returned to the United States for maintenance, but not rest. The moment it docked, teams began evaluating the need for extensive modernization. The world had changed rapidly, and the carrier needed to change with it. Electronic systems were updated, sensors replaced, equipment modernized. New technologies emerged every year, and the U.S. Navy knew that keeping Enterprise relevant required more than simply preserving her nuclear heart. The overhaul was immense. For months, the ship resembled a floating city under reconstruction. Cables were replaced, entire blocks were removed and reinstalled, old computers were retired, and the internal infrastructure adapted to support systems that did not even exist when the carrier was designed. It was like revitalizing a 90,000-ton giant, giving it a new life. When she returned to sea, she was no longer only the veteran of the 1960s and 70s, she was a hybrid of past and future, carrying the experience of old wars and the technology of a new generation. The world was changing, too. Conflicts erupted with increasing frequency. International terrorism had become a diffuse, invisible, unpredictable enemy. fragile nations collapsed, and the United States now assumed an even more intense global role, meaning that its aircraft carriers were called upon to respond to any crisis, anywhere. And Enterprise, as always, stood on the front line. Throughout the 2000s, she took part in complex exercises, deterrence operations, anti-terrorism patrols, maritime blockades, and even humanitarian missions. In some situations, her mere presence prevented greater crises. In others, she was the only American voice in tense waters where poor decisions could trigger disastrous escalations. But there were moments when the nuclear giant reclaimed the world's attention. One such moment came in 2006 when rising tensions in the Middle East placed Enterprise back in the Gulf. The ship became a reference point for Allied forces and simultaneously a symbolic target for hostile groups. Intelligence reports revealed that extremist organizations dreamed of striking the carrier, not because it was easy, but because the symbolic impact would be catastrophic. And so the crew lived under constant alert. Controllers monitored every ship that approached, helicopters hovered over suspicious waters, escort vessels kept strict defensive perimeters. Any small boat could be a threat, any unusual movement was treated as a possible suicide attack. Modern war no longer respected old rules. Inside the ship, however, a parallel reality unfolded. Daily life continued. Meals were served, gyms were used, sailors wrote letters, slept in narrow bunks, laughed when they could. Enterprise was both an operational base and a temporary home for more than 5,000 people. This contrast, war and routine coexisting, was part of what made the ship so unique in military history. But nothing could stop the natural wear of such an old giant. Each year, engineers performed increasingly detailed inspections. Some internal components showed the weight of time. Structures that had survived storms, battles, and thousands of landings and launches now required special care. It was like maintaining a living monument, one that was still fully active. Even so, Enterprise did not slow down.
When Somali piracy exploded in the mid-2000s, she was deployed to the region. It was a surreal mission, a nuclear-powered aircraft carrier equipped with supersonic jets operating against pirates with rifles and small wooden boats. But that was the nature of 21st century conflict, an age of asymmetry, where extreme technology met primitive threats that were still dangerously effective. The crew would later describe this period as strange and challenging. They were trained to fly aircraft capable of destroying entire bases, yet now they had to identify tiny boats lost in vast waters full of fishermen and civilians. It was like searching for needles scattered across an ocean. Yet Enterprise performed the mission with the same professionalism she had shown in high-risk combat. The ship seemed capable of adapting to anything, not only a testament to her engineering, but to the human skill that guided her. But something profound began circulating in Navy conversations. Enterprise was nearing the end of her operational life. Maintaining a nuclear aircraft carrier required colossal effort, and despite her legendary record, her fame, her proven reliability, even the most iconic ship must eventually retire. Still, while officers discreetly discussed the future, the crew pressed on with the same determination as always. And so did the ship. In 2011, during U.S. operations in the Middle East, Enterprise was summoned once more. Many said she seemed revitalized, as if sensing the approach of her farewell, determined to remind the world why she had been so important for so long. Her flight deck roared again with intense launch cycles. Her catapults thundered like it was 1961. Her hull vibrated just as it had during the most critical missions of the Cold War. It was as if the giant declared, "I am still here. I can still do this." And she could. But the clock was relentless. By the end of the decade, Enterprise had accumulated nearly half a century of active service.
Few ships in history had lived as long, and fewer still had played such varied roles. The world had changed countless times, and the carrier had accompanied every transformation as a protagonist. Now the Navy began preparing for the transition. New carriers were coming, bigger, more advanced, more automated, digitally integrated, vessels designed for the wars of tomorrow. Yet none of them would carry the historical weight of the world's first nuclear carrier. And as this transition approached, a new feeling grew among sailors and admirals alike. Not just respect, but reverence. The crew knew they served aboard a symbol. The admirals knew they were witnessing the end of an era. And the ship itself, in its quiet steel dignity, seemed aware. USS Enterprise was not simply a military vessel. It was a living piece of world history, a colossus that had crossed 51 years without ever becoming irrelevant. And as it approached its final days, it carried with it everything it had learned, everything it had endured, everything it had represented. Because some ships are made of steel, but others, like Enterprise, are made of memory. And that memory was about to meet its final chapter.
When Enterprise began its final decade of service, a strange feeling started to drift through her corridors. It was as if every metal plate, every rivet, every compartment that had once echoed with battle orders somehow knew that the clock was winding down, that the journey spanning half a century was entering its final chapters. And yet the ship sailed with the same relentless determination it had always shown. At the start of 2012, when Enterprise received orders for another deployment to the Middle East, many believed it would be just a routine mission, but for those aboard, there was something different in the air. Walking through the narrow passageways, one could feel an almost reverent silence, as if everyone sensed that each aircraft launch, each maneuver on deck, each dawn at sea was being lived for the last time. The ship that had sailed during the height of the Cold War, faced global crises, supported humanitarian missions, and fought modern wars, was now preparing to write its final chapter. When she left port, an unusual quiet settled among the crew standing in formation on the flight deck. Many looked back, watching the coastline slowly fade away. For the youngest sailors, it was just another deployment. For the veterans, it was the closing of a story no other ship could ever replicate. And for the few who had served for decades, that disappearing shoreline tasted like a farewell. Enterprise pushed across the Atlantic with the dignity of a seasoned monarch. Even the ocean seemed to acknowledge her. Waves parted before her bow, as if bowing to a giant that had ruled the seas for more than 50 years. The crew, even in the simplest of tasks, worked with a special sense of care, as though they understood that every action contributed to honoring the ship's legacy. During the transit, aircraft conducted intense training. With each launch, the thunderous roar of the catapults echoed like storms rolling across steel plains, reminding everyone that the carrier was still powerful, still respected, still capable of projecting force thousands of miles from home. The difference was that now every thunderous blast carried the melancholy of an approaching end. When Enterprise finally arrived in the Middle East, the region was once again wrapped in tension. The Arab Spring had reshaped political landscapes, instability seeped across fragile borders, and new conflicts emerged like open wounds. Enterprise took her station as if she were young again, vigilant, dependable, tireless. Her radars swept the horizon endlessly. FA-18 fighters launched and recovered in a steady rhythm. Surveillance missions and presence operations were executed with absolute precision. Even in her age, the ship was still essential, and she acted like it.
But beneath that final deployment lay something deeper, a kind of reckoning.
The nuclear giant seemed determined to fulfill every minute of service with flawless excellence, like a veteran taking one final step with impeccable honor. Inside the ship, daily life continued in its organized chaos. Sailors gathered in the mess hall, laughed over old jokes, played cards, watched movies in makeshift lounges, and wrote emails home. But walking past old plaques bearing dates from the 1960s, photographs of past crews, and markings from decades of refits, it was impossible not to feel the weight of accumulated history in every corner. There were stories everywhere, stories of men who had served long before the youngest sailors were even born, stories of nuclear crises, regional wars, secret missions, apocalyptic storms, miraculous landings. Living aboard Enterprise felt like living inside a museum that still functioned as a frontline war machine. Throughout the final deployment, several moments left deep emotional marks. On one unusually quiet night in the Persian Gulf, the crew gathered on the flight deck to look at the stars. For many, this had become a silent tradition, gazing upward and trying to understand how this ship, powered by nuclear reactors and carrying the might of a small city, had remained faithful to its mission for so many decades. Soft comments broke the silence. Imagine how many people stood right here, looking at this same sky. This ship has seen more history than any of us ever will. After her, there won't be another like this. And it was true. No matter how modern the new Ford-class carriers were, none could ever claim the title of the first nuclear-powered aircraft carrier in history. None had faced Cold War crises, shot down enemy aircraft in the 70s, assisted in astronaut recovery missions, launched strikes in the Gulf War, responded to the September 11th attacks, battled modern piracy, and witnessed the rise of the digital age, all within a single lifespan. When the final deployment ended and the Giant returned to the United States, something extraordinary happened. As Enterprise approached the coastline, thousands of people gathered ashore to witness the arrival of the historic vessel. Families held emotional signs. Veterans wore old medals proudly. Children, many who knew Enterprise only from movies and books, lifted their eyes to see the colossal silhouette emerging on the horizon. And when the ship slowly moved through the channel, a reverent hush swept through the crowd, followed by applause that seemed endless.
The crew standing on deck watched the scene with a blend of pride and disbelief. Some had served on only one deployment, others on many, a few through half their careers, but all knew they were part of something larger than themselves. It was not just the end of a mission, it was the beginning of a farewell to an icon. The deactivation process began like a slow, almost ritual ceremony. Equipment was shut down for the last time, systems depressurized, documents archived, sensors, cables, and consoles were removed with careful hands like relics, and each step carried an emotional weight difficult to describe. Veteran officers walking through the now empty hangar spoke of hearing echoes, not real sounds, but memories, decades of aircraft being pushed, engines roaring, orders shouted. Younger sailors whispered that the ship felt sad, as if aware that its purpose had come to an end. And indeed, Enterprise had never been just metal. It carried too many stories, too many memories, too many lives. The official deactivation ceremony gathered representatives from across the Navy, dignitaries, former commanding officers, and crew members from multiple generations. The keynote speech echoed across the deck. This ship did not serve only the Navy. She served history. No one doubted it. Old uniforms resurfaced. Letters written decades earlier were read aloud. Tales of battle, courage, and even absurd humor were shared. Every person there carried a different version of Enterprise inside them. When the final moment arrived and the ship was officially retired from service, an almost spiritual silence settled. Nothing could be heard but the wind. After 51 years of active duty, Enterprise ceased being a combat vessel, but did not cease to exist. The hull that had endured wars, storms, and generations now became a permanent memory, preserved, studied, revered. And as the flag was lowered, one truth remained. There would never be another ship like her. USS Enterprise had crossed eras, witnessed the impossible, survived the improbable, shaped naval history, and left a legacy beyond any technical manual. She was the first, the pioneer, the ultimate symbol of nuclear naval power. And above all, she was a silent witness to an entire century of humanity. When the lights dimmed and the flight deck stood empty for the last time, the giant rested. Not defeated, not forgotten, but eternal. Because some ships do not end their lives in the ocean. They end in history.
Even after its official decommissioning, USS Enterprise did not fade from the Navy's consciousness, nor from the American imagination. Quite the opposite. It seemed that the silence settling over her hull after the final shutdown had awakened something even greater, a wave of memory, tribute, curiosity, and reflection that spread across the country, reaching people who had never set foot aboard a ship, but understood instinctively that this giant was an inseparable part of the United States military identity. When Enterprise was towed back to Newport News, the very shipyard where she had been born, journalists asked Navy officials if they were emotionally prepared to see the ship dismantled. The response was always the same: "We are not dismantling a ship, we are closing a chapter of the nation." And it wasn't an exaggeration. As the carrier arrived, thousands gathered along the banks of the James River to see the Colossus one final time. Some were elderly former crew members who brought their children and grandchildren to show them the vessel that had shaped their lives. Others were war veterans who, even without having served on Enterprise, recognized it as the purest symbol of the Navy's nuclear era. And among the crowd were curious young people, fascinated by the idea of seeing with their own eyes the legendary aircraft carrier that had starred in crises, films, books, documentaries, and debates for more than half a century. As cranes and platforms secured the hull, an uncanny sensation filled the air. Seeing Enterprise motionless, silent, without aircraft landing, without sailors running across the deck, without sirens or PA announcements, it felt like witnessing a titan in deep sleep, breathing only through the memories of those who had known it alive. In the months that followed, internal inspections began. Engineering teams and specialists walked through compartments that had been sealed for decades. Many of these spaces still carried marks of the past, graffiti left by crew members in the 1970s, maintenance lists written in faded ink, calendars pinned to bulkheads with pre-internet dates, analog flight logs, systems that looked like museum pieces, and in a sense they were. Every hatch opened revealed a time capsule. In a side corridor, they found a board signed by pilots who served in the Vietnam War. In another area, boxes of documents from covert missions during the Cold War. In a forgotten room, photographs of entire crews with messages scrawled on the back, reminders left by men who were likely no longer alive, but whose lives had been permanently shaped by this ship. These discoveries moved not only engineers, but historians, journalists, military personnel, and especially veterans allowed to tour the shipyard in special visits. Many cried as they stepped into the empty hangar bay.
Some ran their hands along the steel walls as if touching an old friend. Others simply stood in silence, staring at the space where for decades aircraft had roared, launched, and landed without rest. It was too much memory for any museum to contain.
Meanwhile, the debate over Enterprise's final fate took new directions. Some proposed turning it into a floating museum, like USS Intrepid or USS Midway. But there was one monumental obstacle: the nuclear reactors. Enterprise had 8 of them, an unprecedented and extremely complex system to remove and decontaminate. The costs were astronomical, and tragically, this made preserving the ship intact impossible. But letting it disappear without leaving a physical legacy felt unacceptable. Thus, a new plan emerged: preserve essential parts and turn them into monuments, museum exhibits, and permanent displays that would keep the giant's memory alive. Navigation towers, original plaques, instruments, catapult components, bulkheads, portholes, pieces of the flight deck, and entire corridor sections were carefully removed to be restored and shown to future generations. Some would go to naval museums. Some would be installed at military bases to inspire new sailors. And a select number of pieces would form the official Enterprise Memorial, a massive project the Navy began developing with universities, museums, and historical institutions. As this process advanced, official reports were released, revealing fascinating details about how the ship had aged. Despite the expected wear of more than half a century of intense operations, many sections of Enterprise were astonishingly well preserved. This reinforced the belief that the ship had been built not only with innovative technology, but with a near-handcrafted robustness, an engineering quality rarely seen in modern times. The public followed every development closely. Television networks produced long-form specials. Military magazines published commemorative issues. History channels released documentaries that drew millions of viewers. Online forums exploded with discussions about the carrier's life and legacy. Enterprise had transcended naval history. It now touched fields like popular culture, philosophy, sociology, memory studies, and national identity. For many, it represented continuity, the bridge between the analog world of the Cold War and the digital world of the 21st century. A ship that had survived enormous transformations, political, technological, cultural, and military. But none of this compared to the emotional impact the ship had on those who served aboard her. As the carrier's physical end approached, veteran gatherings became more frequent. Men and women who had served in different decades came together to share memories. Some recalled early mornings in the North Atlantic when the ship battled storms that felt capable of swallowing the world. Others retold stories of last-second rescues, tense missions, near-fatal mechanical failures, and unlikely victories made possible only through courage and stubbornness. There was laughter, tears, embraces, and a universal truth spoken in many ways. Enterprise had transformed them. For many, serving on the ship was not just a job, it was a formation, a life lesson, a rite of passage, something that shaped character, discipline, courage, and friendship. And as they looked at photos of the dismantling process, many repeated the same phrase: "It feels like watching a friend being buried." The Navy, fully aware of the emotional weight of the moment, began planning something monumental: the creation of USS Enterprise CVN-80. The spiritual successor to the legendary CVN-65. For many veterans, this announcement felt like a personal victory. The name Enterprise would not die. It would sail again, protect again, inspire again. The legacy would continue,
not in a static museum, but in another giant destined to cross the oceans with the same authority as the original. And gradually, a comforting truth began to spread. Enterprise was not being destroyed, it was being transformed. Transformed into memory, into symbol, into future inspiration, into an eternal link to the Navy's past. Still, as the hull was gradually taken apart, section by section, there was something undeniably poetic in the process. With each plate removed, each steel panel lifted, each corridor erased, it felt as though decades of history were being released into the air, not lost, but carried into the world by those who refused to let the ship be forgotten. And in the end, one simple truth stood above all. USS Enterprise did not belong solely to the sea. It belonged to time, to human memory, to the millions who found in it not just power, but meaning. Even dismantled, it remained alive, not in steel, but in legacy. And that legacy would only grow larger. Because some machines do not end when they are decommissioned, they begin.
The final years of the USS Enterprise's physical existence unfolded. It became impossible to ignore the emotional weight surrounding each stage of her dismantling. This was not like decommissioning a typical ship. It was like witnessing an entire era being taken apart, piece by piece, memory by memory, life by life. And the more the hull shrank, the larger her symbolic presence grew, expanding like a historic shadow, refusing to disappear. The enormous structures that once supported supersonic aircraft were now removed with almost surgical care. The hangar, which had witnessed thousands of missions, rescues, emergencies, and training operations, began losing its familiar shape. For many engineers, entering that empty space was unsettling. They could still imagine distant echoes of engines, shouted commands, hurried footsteps, alarms, and the roar of aircraft being launched into the sky within seconds. All of that now existed only in memory, but it was a memory far too powerful to fade. The removal of the nuclear reactors, one of the most complex and delicate procedures ever undertaken in the history of the U.S. Navy, marked a decisive moment. For decades, those 8 nuclear cores had been the beating heart of the ship. Now they were dismantled with absolute precision, each component catalogued, cooled, isolated, and prepared for its final destination. It was not merely engineering, it was an act of respect. Respect for the power that had fueled the carrier, and respect for the lives that had relied on it. When the last reactor was finally removed, a silent ripple passed through the entire team. For the first time in its existence, it felt as though Enterprise had stopped breathing. At the same time, far from the shipyard, the world continued to absorb the emotional impact of its farewell. Special exhibitions began circulating in museums across the United States, displaying original pieces of the ship, sections of flight deck, navigation instruments, control panels, pilot helmets, ejection seats, logbooks, annotated maps from real crises, fragments of cables and pipes that had supported operations for 5 decades. Each item drew crowds. Each exhibition was accompanied by long lines of veterans, curious visitors, students, and families. Some reached out to touch the artifacts as if touching living history. Others simply observed in deep silence. And there were those who cried without knowing exactly why. They just felt that strange mixture of pride and farewell that only cultural giants can evoke. And Enterprise was a cultural giant. Coastal cities began building memorials using original fragments of the ship's hull. In emotional ceremonies, former crew members took the stage to share their stories. They spoke of violent storms that nearly capsized the carrier,
of night landings that demanded absolute courage, of missions that never made the newspapers but saved lives and changed destinies. They also spoke of the unique camaraderie aboard, that unbreakable bond known only to those who have lived at sea.
Many veterans admitted they had never fully separated themselves from Enterprise, that even decades later, the ship remained present in their dreams, their conversations, their lives. And now, watching the ship being dismantled, they felt as though a vital part of themselves was being laid to rest. Meanwhile, construction of the new USS Enterprise, CVN-80, continued to advance. Every new component installed, every steel plate welded, every module added seemed to carry a symbolic particle of the original ship. It was as if the past were being carefully transferred to a new body, not literally, but spiritually. On the shipyard walls, posters displayed photographs of the CVN-65 with the words, "The legend continues." And indeed, it did. The future CVN-80's crew, even before the ship officially existed, had already inherited an enormous historical weight. Young sailors who had not even been born when Enterprise fought in 20th century wars now felt a sense of pride knowing they would serve on a carrier carrying 7 decades of legacy. The name Enterprise was not just a name, it was a responsibility. Back at the original ship's hull, the dismantling reached its final stages. The industrial landscape gained a dramatic aura, massive machines, colossal cranes, sparks flying, artificial lights reflecting off twisted metal surfaces. It was like watching the last embers of a giant fire slowly fade. Then came the most symbolic moment of all, the removal of the superstructure, the island, the ship's brain. That tower had been the stage for critical decisions. There, commanders had made choices that impacted entire nations. There, lives were saved and, tragically, lost. It was sacred ground for pilots, air controllers, and officers. When the crane lifted the island from the hull, hundreds of onlookers fell into absolute silence. Some removed their hats. Others saluted. Many recorded the moment, but few spoke. Because at that exact moment, everyone understood. This was the end. The physical end. The end of a body. The end of a giant. But not the end of its story. When the remaining hull was finally cut apart and prepared for recycling, something remarkable happened. Instead of diminishing its importance, the process strengthened its significance. Enterprise was becoming something no warship had ever achieved, an active myth, a permanent symbol, an icon destined to resonate across culture, politics, engineering, cinema, technology, and military memory.
You can take apart the steel, but you can't take apart what this ship did for us. And he was right. Enterprise inspired generations, protected nations, changed wars, created legends, made history, and above all, touched lives. When the last piece of the hull was removed from the shipyard, the Navy held a small private ceremony. There were no crowds, no bands, no grand speeches, only officers, engineers, and a handful of veterans standing silently. One veteran placed a hand on the weathered steel and said, "Thank you for everything." Few words, but enough to summarize 7 decades of greatness. In the end, as the sun set over the horizon and cast golden light across the shipyard, it was clear that something extraordinary had occurred. Not the destruction of a ship, but the final consecration of its legacy.
The USS Enterprise no longer existed physically, but it had become eternal. And as the new Enterprise prepares to take its place upon the seas, the spirit of the CVN-65 sails forward, not anchored to the past, but guiding the future. Because giants do not disappear, they transform. And Enterprise was never merely steel. It was, and always will be, living history.